You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Graham Davis is an award-winning journalist who, like me, was born in Fiji. He was deeply involved inside the Bainimarama government and then ultimately saw there needed to be change in Fiji, and so campaigned to help end that government. At first, he was an enthusiastic supporter of the new government led by Sitiveni Rabuka, but he's become disillusioned with the political and constitutional developments back in our home country. To discuss Fiji's coup culture and political developments, he joins me now. Graham Davis, welcome to The Crunch.
Thanks, Cam.
Now, for our listeners' edification, you're a Kaiviti, like me, born in Fiji.
Yes, that's right.
A few years ahead of me, I might add.
Not that many, old boy.
No, but, you were brought up in Fiji and then went on to become essentially a journalist and foreign correspondent. You've won a few awards, and then you went back to Fiji to help out the Bainimarama government. Yes. But I thought it'd be a good idea, Graham, before we get started on what's happening now in Fiji, to do a little bit of a history on the coup culture and the things that we've witnessed as people who were born in Fiji, and you know, the hopes and things that we might have ended at some point, but it looks like we're heading back towards that coup culture again.
Yes. Well, look, Cam, as you know, Fiji gained its independence from Britain in 1970, and there were very high hopes that it would actually, defy the trends in the third world to kind of go downhill, take the Zimbabwe road, and that Fiji could be an example to the world. And in fact, the visiting Pope in 1986 visited Fiji, Pope Paul, I think it was, and said Fiji, was the way the world should be, because there was racial harmony and economic progress and all of that. Well, all that came to an end in 1987 when Sitiveni Rabuka, who 36 years later is again the prime minister, staged two coups in 1987. And of course, he did it in the name of indigenous supremacy. At that time, Fiji, the majority population in Fiji, were the Indians who'd been brought by the British to work in the cane fields. Yep. They outnumbered the Itākei. The Itākei felt threatened, or certainly that's what Rabuka said. So as number 3 in the military at the time, he staged the first coup in May 1987 and then another one later in the year. And this was to assert indigenous supremacy. It's quite a long story in the sense that sort of after a period of military rule, Sitiveni Rabuka won an election and for some years was the democratically elected leader of Fiji, and sort of Fiji returned to parliamentary rule and everything was fine. What happened in 2000, if you'll recall, was the George Speight rebellion, which was against, an Indian or Indo-Fijian elected prime minister called Mahendra Chaudhry. Now, he was removed by Speight with the support of some elements of the military. And of course, after a period in which this was put down and George Speight became the last person to be sentenced to death in Fiji, to hang by the neck, but this was subsequently sort of commuted to life imprisonment, and he remains in jail in Fiji.
He's quite mad, isn't he?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, he certainly had delusions of grandeur at the time, but he still commands a tremendous amount of support. And in fact, there have been moves by the present government, led by Rabuka, and his Attorney General, a guy called Siromi Turanga, who's a fanatical Christian and also an indigenous supremacist, to free George Speight. Now, the current military have said that that's not on, and that would trigger an immediate coup. So the plans to release Speight that were being mooted earlier in the year haven't come to pass. But look, to cut a long story short, and I know you wanted to dwell on some of the background of this, in 2006, Frank Bainimarama staged a coup in Fiji against the ethno-nationalists, at that stage led by a guy called Laisania Garase. So the military took over, they imposed their will on the country.
Now, Garase was hopelessly corrupt, wasn't he?
Well, look, what is corrupt in the Fijian context? I mean, I'm not going to point a particular finger at him because, there are all sorts of shenanigans that go on in the place. Suffice it to say, though, that his indigenous supremacist agenda included a thing called the Gorlingorli Bill, which would have required non-Italke or non-Indigenous people to pay to use natural resources, like to pay to go to the beach, to pay to go fishing, even though they were full citizens. Now, that was unacceptable to Frank Bainimarama as head of the military, and he staged a coup and removed Garase. Until 2014, Fiji was ruled with an iron fist by Frank Bainimarama.
Yeah.
In 2013, he and his Attorney General, a guy called Ayaz Said Qayyum, produced a constitution. Now, the constitution, there were sort of, superficial consultations, but essentially it was foisted on the country. And for the first time, that constitution provided for a common and equal citizenry in which, every vote was equal because it was weighted in favor of the Indigenous people in previous constitutions. A 1990 constitution and a 1997 constitution. So, in other words, Bainimarama and Qayyum leveled the playing field. Yeah, they also
those are admirable goals, weren't they?
Well, absolutely. I think you supported it, didn't you?
Well, I think you and I both did. We were quite vocal, saying, "Well, this is the way forward. You can't have a country that's separated by race." Ironic, given that you live in Australia and you've just had the Voice debate, and in New Zealand we've got this ongoing co-governance and treaty principles debate that's going on in New Zealand. We only need to look at Fiji on what happens if you do start having laws where race is separated in particular parts of it to see what a disaster that ends up in. I mean, Sitiveni Rabuka's first two coups were entirely race-based. It was about subjugating the Indian population, the Indo-Fijian population. And then we had, Bainimarama, who supposedly was going to now create this equality. And this is why we supported him, because here he was working hand in glove with an Indo-Fijian and saying we're all one people. That included people like ourselves who sometimes are disparagingly called Kaivalangi, right? Foreigners. And in actual fact, we were born in Fiji. I was born in Suva. You were born
in Suva as well.
I
think we were born in the same maternity unit, right?
Probably, but we're as much Fijian as anybody else. And so it was welcome to hear somebody who's Italkai saying we're all the same. You're born in Fiji.
Well, you see,
you're a Fijian.
This is the thing. I know, Cam, and this is the thing. Even today, a lot of Italkai don't accept the fact that if you're born in Fiji, that makes you a full citizen, a Fijian. And in fact, one of the things that has caused a huge amount of upset in Fiji since Rabuka came back to power by one vote on the floor of the parliament last December is that he endorsed the notion that Italkai refer to Fiji citizens born in Fiji as Vulangi. Now, Vulangi means visitor. Yeah,
it's rude.
Well, it is rude, but it's also interpreted by non-Italkai as a fundamental assault on the constitutional provision for a common and equal citizenry and a common identity. Because Bainimarama made everybody Fijian. Now that was against a huge protest by the Italkai who actually believed that this English word Fijian belongs to them. Now, so this has been a simmering problem. And so it's also important for the audience in New Zealand to realise this, Cam, which you already know. Yes. Since 1987, tens of thousands of Indo-Fijians and people of other races left Fiji. So that the indigenous people now comprise more than 60% of the population, right? Yeah. They own 94% of the total land surface. They were never dispossessed in the way Maori or Aborigines were in Australia.
Yeah.
So there is no threat whatsoever to them in terms of their position in national life, and yet they have this kind of notion that somehow, they should have supremacy and ascendancy over the other races. And this is one of the great ironies, as far as I'm concerned. ETLK come and live in Australia and New Zealand. Yeah, they're benefiting from these work programs and everything else. They get full entitlement to everything. No one in Australia says, "Oh, listen, you don't belong here. You're a visitor here." They come and go. And in fact, Fiji's second biggest revenue earner, and during the pandemic, its first biggest revenue, was remittances sent by Fijians working, in the diaspora back home. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I have, in extremis described Fiji as a beggar nation because it's dependent on Fijians living overseas sending money back to their people. It's dependent on foreign aid, and it's dependent on the tourists, including New Zealanders, who go to Fiji and keep the whole place afloat.
And the United Nations who rent their soldiers.
Well, exactly. And something really very disturbing has happened recently in relation to this government, and that is, as you know, there was a vote at the United Nations, sponsored by the Arab countries, for there to be a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza to enable them to get sort of relief to the civilians in Gaza and to end the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. New Zealand, as you know, supported the humanitarian resolution. Australia abstained, but Fiji sided with Israel to support the continuation of the bombardment when it has peacekeepers, Fijian peacekeepers, in the Middle East. Now, I would have thought that was a folly of the first order because it immediately makes them targets. Well, and in 2014, Fijian peacekeepers were kidnapped and held hostage by a group called Al-Nusra, and it took Qatar and various other Arab countries to come to Fiji's assistance and to pay ransoms amounting to tens of millions of dollars for the release of these people. Now, are those ransoms going to be forthcoming now that Fiji has voted with Israel at the UN?
Well, it's tens of millions of dollars that the UN remits to Fiji for renting its soldiers. And into 2014, I was actually in Israel when that happened, when they were kidnapped by Al-Nusra. And, I was up on Mount Bental in the Golan Heights and, when it happened, and there were actually some Fijian soldiers there, and I was having a good old chinwag with them when the news broke, and they were sort of up sticks and bugged out, ready to go and get their mates back, and they were all ready to go for it. So, I remember that very, very clearly in 2014. And it's funny because I went to Israel via Suva because I interviewed Frank Bainimarama after he just won the election in 2014.
Yeah.
And so, I remember that very starkly. And it just shows, though, that there's something strange happening in Fiji at the moment. And that's why I wanted to get you on my show so that we could kind of unravel it, because the media here has a somewhat slanted view of Fiji, and the general population in New Zealand, and I imagine it's the same in Australia, the only time they think about Fiji is when they're going for their winter holidays, or one or two of the All Blacks or Wallabies team are from Fiji.
Yeah,
that's about the only contact.
Or when there's a coup.
Or when there's a coup, right? Now, and I know that apart from the Spate coup, that coups in Fiji are somewhat circumspect as far as coups worldwide go. I mean,
you mean in the sense that they're not, they don't have deaths or whatever.
Yeah, they sort of they block off about 3 blocks in Suva and a couple of bridges. And that's pretty much it. Life goes on around. In fact, I've had mates as you have tell us that it's actually quite good having a coup in Fiji because it solves the crime problem for a while.
Well, this is a very important thing. If this was Papua New Guinea, it might be different, because New Guinea, the people of Papua New Guinea, as you know, are armed to the teeth.
Yeah.
The military in Fiji has always ensured that the military, the RFMF, are the only people in Fiji who have weapons, right?
Yeah.
So that the police aren't armed and the civilians are. aren't armed. And so that accounts for the fact that may account for the fact that there have been minimum casualties in these altercations in the past.
Yeah.
But you hit on a very important point there. And look, I don't blame Australian and New Zealand media, except for their relative lack of interest in the Pacific until now, of course, because it's changing because, everyone's worried about Chinese influence.
Yes.
Because, as far as Fiji is concerned, I mean, you were born there, I was born there, but we'd still have to, acknowledge the truth of Churchill saying about Russia, that to coin that phrase, that Fiji is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Yeah, it's incredibly hard to find out what the hell's going on there at any one time.
And the coconut wireless, as it's affectionately called in Fiji, and for listeners who think that that's an insult, that's actually what people call it in Fiji. The coconut wireless is faster than any media or electronic form known to man.
Yes, and that's in the Pacific generally, because I was fascinated when I went to New Caledonia that they call it, radio cocotier. So it's a Pacific thing, the drums of rumour.
Somebody in Nandi, someone in Nandi or Lambasa knows what's going on in Suva before the people in Suva know what's going on in Suva. It's that quick.
That's sometimes true, but of course the other problem is, Cam, and you'd understand this, that every story in the retelling, is modified in some way, so that once it's retold sort of a dozen times, it can be a very remote resemblance of the original story.
Yes.
So the rumor mill in Fiji, churns away relentlessly. And I mean, I've got a daily blog on politics, and it's just one of the biggest challenges I have really is to separate rumor from fact.
Yeah.
And I have a policy that, if I get something wrong, that I correct it and I apologize. Yep. Fortunately, that doesn't happen too often, but only because I've had, international media training in which, you generally try to make sure that what you're reporting is correct. You can never be 100% certain, but at least you're making an effort. Yeah.
Yeah. You've also got a network of people, that are in business or, it's like me as well. When I'm dealing with Fiji, or talking, I always, make sure I talk to you or I talk to some of the other people that I've known that are in government or not in government or in business, just to try and get a feel of what's going on. But, I've found in the last few months, it devilishly difficult to get any semblance or a view of where the direction of travel is in Fiji and the government.
Well, look, there's a pretty easy explanation for that, right? Mm. Most people, even though Fiji first got more votes than anyone else in the last election, and they're the majority, they're the biggest bloc in the parliament. There was a huge movement for change. I mean, Bainimarama and Kayum had become increasingly dictatorial, increasingly authoritarian. They had begun to breach, the very constitution that they had imposed on the country. And there was a huge sentiment for change. And Sitiveni Rambuka managed, quite cleverly, really, to persuade everybody that he was a leopard who changed his spots. He was no longer the indigenous supremacist of 1987.
He convinced
but a man for all people. Yes, he convinced me. In fact, this was the thing. I said, I'm willing to accept the fact that he's changed, but I did recommend that people vote for his coalition partner, the National Federation Party led by Bim Prasad, as a means, which is a moderate party compared to, my perception certainly of Sitiveni Rambuka's People's Alliance. But, I've had to be very critical of Bim Prasad because he's allowed Sitiveni Rambuka in the 11 months since the last election in December to pursue these policies which are not in the best interests of non-Italke and non-Indigenous people. And also, they are putting at risk national stability because they're doing exactly what the military in Fiji have said that they must not do, and that is that they are defying the 2013 Constitution and its provisions.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a good time to lead to the current thing, Cam, because at year's end, after 11 months of these guys, there's a constitutional crisis looming and the very real prospect of a military intervention again.
Well, see, this is like, just before we get into that, I mean, I've met Pio Tikinduadua many times, had discussions with him, and he always struck me as a man of integrity, a straight up shooter.
Good guy, yeah.
He actually went to war with Bainimarama inside the Bainimarama government, and he was treated appallingly by Bainimarama and particularly by the then Attorney General.
Yeah.
And left, and there was all sorts of rumors that he had all these diseases and all these things were going on, but he's still there. And I struggle to see how he can sit there propping up a government that appears to be acting against the best interest of every Fijian.
Well, there is that. There's no doubt about that. But, leaving aside the question of motive and what have you, you've got to remember that these people these are minority parties. Yeah,
yes.
There's a 5% threshold that you have to meet in Fiji to get any seats in the parliament at all, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the National Federation Party only just made it across the threshold for them to get 3 seats, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the same happened with SEDELPA, which is the other member of the coalition, the three-legged stool, they call it, the People's Alliance, the National Federation Party, and SEDELPA.
Rabuka gutted SEDELPA, though, didn't he? When he split away and created the People's Alliance, a lot of the people from SEDELPA went there, and they're essentially a rump party.
Yes, but they delivered government by one vote to the existing coalition that had been formed before the election between the People's Alliance and the National Federation Party. But just to return to your point, the reason why these guys are enablers and appeasers is that they have got cabinet positions which they would otherwise not have. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they've been propelled into positions of power because of the arrangements that have been forged, and they need to keep the coalition in power, whatever it takes. Yeah. Now I've waged a big campaign against the Minister for Education in the coalition, who beat and tortured his ex-wife, who happened to be Sitiveni Rambuka's daughter, right? To the point where Rambuka found her bloodied in the family home and only just got her to hospital in time to save her life. He is now not only one of Rambuka's ministers in the cabinet, he's the Minister for Education, right? So a domestic violence perpetrator is in charge of the futures of Fijian young people. Now, why is that happening? And without any protest whatsoever from the women's movement in Fiji, it's because of their desperation to keep the coalition in power and stave off any return by Bainimarama.
But Bainimarama is not going to come back, is he? I mean, he's out of Parliament. He escaped he was prosecuted, but was eventually wasn't convicted.
No, but Cam, I don't know whether you're aware, the illegal Director of Public Prosecutions has appealed the acquittal, and Bainimarama and Sitiveni Gilio, the suspended police commissioner, are back in court this week again because the acting DPP has appealed their acquittals and has asked the High Court, without any hearing, to on the basis of his allegation that the magistrate got it wrong, to record guilty verdicts against them. So,
well, this is just going to cause more unrest and more uncertainty. I mean, the whole replacement of the Director of Public Prosecutions is illegal anyway. What went on there?
Well, not so much that in a sense, and this is very important. Somebody you know, and is a New Zealander, so people listening will be interested. Yeah. A New Zealander called Christopher Pride,
one of the most straight up people I've ever met.
Well, that's why he was appointed in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah. He's straight as an arrow, that guy.
Yeah. So he was DPP for the best part of a decade.
Yeah.
After the election, he was photographed at a public function at the Japanese embassy residence talking to the ousted Attorney General Ayaz Syed Qayyum.
Yeah.
The new Attorney General, Hiromi Turanga, ordered the acting Chief Justice, who, by the way, had replaced somebody else in that job of Chief Justice who was accused of misbehaviour. They relieved Christopher Pride of his position. They suspended him on a charge of misbehaviour for being seen in public with a member of the previous government. And 7 months later, his case has not been heard by a tribunal of 3 judges, which the Constitution stipulates must happen. Yeah,
yeah,
and so he's still waiting for justice to be done. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's going on, and so that was one. That's the defiance of the Constitution on one level.
Yes,
but what this new appointment as acting Chief Justice has done is even more serious. He has appointed 2 individuals to senior officers of state whose appointments are in violation of the Constitution. One of these guys, the acting Director of Public Prosecutions, a guy called John Rambuku, was found guilty of professional misconduct by the Legal Services Commission. And on that basis, the Constitution specifically prohibits him from holding that job. Similarly, a Supreme Court judge and Court of Appeal judge by the name of Alipati Kataki, he too was found guilty of professional misconduct by the Legal Services Commission. That didn't stop the current acting Chief Justice appointing those 2 people. Now, this is outrageous in the sense that it is a full-blown assault on the Constitution. Yeah. So what's happening is that the Fiji Law Society, and I'm telling you this, and it's a breaking story in the sense that sort of no one else has got it.
Exclusive to Reality Check Radio at this point.
Absolutely exclusive to your program. The Fiji Law Society, which is the national group of lawyers in private practice, is preparing a court challenge to these unlawful appointments of the acting DPP and the Supreme Court judge, which will be an unprecedented showdown. Yeah, it'll pit the legal profession against the judiciary.
Yeah.
And it's come about specifically because the acting Chief Justice appointed by this government has defied the Constitution and refuses to accede to the demands of the nation's lawyers that these illegal appointments be reversed. Now, there's been a whole lot of...
That has huge implications, doesn't it, Graham? Because what most New Zealanders don't understand, and particularly Australians as well wouldn't understand, is that the Constitution that we're talking about here, that's essentially being abrogated by this government. A key part of that Constitution is the provision of the Royal Military of Fiji to guard the Constitution and act as necessary to protect the Constitution.
Absolutely.
So what we're seeing here is we're actually on the cusp of another coup, aren't we?
Well, look, we are very close to a military intervention. And if I could just refer to that clause in the Constitution that you mentioned, it's Section 1312 of the Constitution. And it says this, right? It shall be the overall responsibility of the Republic of Fiji military forces to ensure at all times the security, defence and well-being of Fiji and all Fijians. Now, that is a very broad statement. Yeah, you can take that whichever way you want. But this year alone, we know that the commander of the RFMF, Major General Raw John A. Colony Y, has warned the government, the new government, at least 3 times in person and in writing, that he expects them to obey the Constitution. The RFMF has always regarded itself as the custodian and guardian of the 2013 Constitution. So, we're entering very dangerous territory here.
Now, there's a few memoranda that have come out of the camp, out of the barracks, isn't there, which have credibility. And you've published several of those. Presumably, you've verified that these have come out of senior officers within the army. of the concerns that they have?
I mean, this is the thing, you talk about verification. I have done what I can to verify these, but the most important thing is that nobody at a high level in the RFMF has said, when I've published these things, this is wrong, Grubsheet, which is the name of my Facebook page, has got this wrong. So, I have published these in good faith, saying they are purported to have emerged from the military. But there is absolutely no doubt about the fact that the commander of the RFMF has told the government that the military expects them to obey the Constitution, and they're not doing it.
Which then leads to the possibility that the military will intercede to restore the Constitution. And if that means removing the elected government, so be it.
Well, there's another stage before that, and that is the possibility of a constitutional coup, in that the government itself is very unstable. There's another piece of news which I can break, that there was a recent direct challenge to the Prime Minister when a deputation led by his deputy, a guy called Manoa Kamikamica, went to him and demanded that he step down. Now, apparently, according to the information I've received, the NFP leader, Birman Prasad, intervened on Rambuka's behalf and told Kamikamica and his supporters that he would take the NFP out of the coalition unless they backed off. But this restiveness in the government, right, this threat to Rambuka's position is very real. Now, this is what I'm about to tell you is also a crucial building block of where we're going with this. And that is that although the Constitution stipulates that you can't have a fresh election in Fiji for 18 months until 18 months after the poll, and we're 11 months out from the 2022 election, a motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister can be called at any time by any MP. Now,
we're sort of at 12 months now, aren't we? So in 6 months' time that facility becomes available.
Yeah, but there's also the possibility that in the parliamentary session that begins next week, there could be a motion of no confidence in Rambuka, which would not only bring him down, but bring his cabinet down. And if SEDELPA, as the rumour mill has it, is contemplating doing a deal with Fiji First to bring down the government, this leaves open the possibility of a constitutional coup against Rambuka. That it's all kosher. To use the Israeli expression, and that the international community doesn't get upset, and there's a relatively smooth transfer of power.
But you and I both know that, and this is for our listeners' benefit.
Yeah,
Fiji First and SEDELPA have been at war since the first coup by Bainimarama.
Yeah, but there are some intriguing. This is the riddle wrapped in the enigma. Yeah.
It's the emergence of Linda Tambua, isn't it?
No, before that, it's that the leader of SEDELPA, the parliamentary leader of SEDELPA, Viliami Gavoka, is the father-in-law of Ayaz Syed Qayyum, who was Bainimarama's partner all through those years.
Yes.
See, this is Fiji. This is what happens in small countries. All of these kind of filial relationships as well as sort of cronyism. Yeah,
it's cronyism, nepotism, all wrapped up in with intrigue and double dealing and backstabbing and everything else that goes with it, all around the kava bowl.
I mean, it's specific. It's Byzantine behaviour writ large in the Pacific there.
Yeah,
and it's not just Fiji, of course. The same thing happens in PNG, Solomons, and various other places. But we are entering a period of danger because if the military stipulation that the Constitution must be adhered to is being challenged by the acting Chief Justice, the head of the judiciary and the alternative head of state, and he refuses to back down not to the demands of the politicians but the country's lawyers, this increases the pressure and increases the possibility of a military intervention. Now, I don't think this would be like 2006, They're not going to take power themselves. They have absolutely no taste for power themselves. So what they would probably do in consultation with the head of state, who's their commander in chief, they could immediately appoint an interim government comprised of, members of the opposition and whoever else is willing to join it, and announce a fresh election date, saying that they had no choice but to act because of the threats to the constitution, but also because of the instability, and that the country would have another chance to sort of have a say in who governed them, right?
Yeah, I can just imagine
that's the other possibility.
Yeah, I can just imagine the British High Commission and their staff peering over the back fence at Berkeley Crescent to see the comings and goings.
Yeah.
Of course, that's where the RFMF strategic headquarters is, just up the road from the British High Commissioner's residence.
That's right. Yes. No, it's a fascinating time. And see, the thing is, what's changed also is public sentiment. I mean, when the new government came in, there was a wave of goodwill towards them.
Yeah.
Because there was a sort of this was a change. There were fresh faces and what have you, and so many things had happened under the Fiji first government and under Bainimarama and Kayum that had upset everybody.
Well, I said to Bainimarama and to Kayum ahead of that election, I said, what you guys forget is that this isn't your second term that you're at the end of.
Yeah,
you've been in power since the point you took power at the point of a gun. It's not 2 terms and people are sick of you. It's a legacy of much longer than that.
Yeah, 16 years.
Yeah, 16 years.
16 years. Like everyone was fed up with them.
Australian governments and New Zealand governments don't last that long, right?
That's right.
They only lasted that long because for a good chunk of that, they were in control of all the guns.
Yeah.
And then they had one election, and then they scraped by in the second election. And they were at the end of that, and of course they forgot, like all politicians, I guess, and started believing their own press releases. And
absolutely,
people were sick of them. And here's the thing, right? Again, for our listeners' benefit, I don't think I explained it properly at the start, but you were deep within the Bainimarama government as an advisor, speech writer, doing all sorts of things inside the government, but you fell out with them because...
Well, I didn't fall out with them, funnily enough. I mean...
they fell out with you.
well, no, but that happened after I'd left, yeah?
Yes.
And if I could just explain, this needs a little bit of context. Just give me 30 seconds. Okay, so the thing was that having been born in Fiji and being brought up with the whole multiracial ideal, it was the only way forward for Fiji to be a success as a nation.
Yep.
When Bainimarama staged his coup in 2006, and the program was to level the playing field, I supported that, and I publicly supported that in articles that I wrote. And so in 2012, out of the blue, I got approached by a Washington PR company by the name of Corvus, asking me whether I was interested in going back to Fiji to work on their account for the Fijian government. And of course, at the time, I mean, I was fronting a TV program and various other things, but it was so appealing to me to actually have the ability to sort of make a difference in the country of my birth, as I'm sure you understand.
I took 100%, up completely.
Yeah, and I took up this thing, and I was a true believer in that. And in fact, I supported them all through 2014. I mean, Frank Bainimarama didn't want to have the election. He wanted to have a referendum on whether to have an election. This is privately. And I said to him, Prime Minister, you can't do that. You've promised the world that you're going to have an election, and you've got to have it, and we'll help you to win it. Yeah, which of course we did, and what have you. And so this all went on quite well. The second election that they had in 2018 was different. By this time, I'd started to get a bit disenchanted with them. But I still left on very good terms, and they thanked me for my service. And of course, I went from there to work on Fiji's global climate campaign.
Yes.
But of course, in the end, I mean, it just became untenable. So I did begin to criticize them at first, softly, and then with a big stick. And of course, I'm hated by both sides in Fiji because not only by Fiji First, who they blame me for sort of their defeat in 2022, but also by this government.
I didn't know you were that powerful, Graham.
Well, look, this is the thing, you see, and this is important for people to realise. The mainstream media in Fiji was repressed with, draconian laws by Bainimarama and Kayum. But having been freed by the new coalition government, they're still, not telling people what's actually going on in the country. And this is the service that I'm providing for people.
Well, they're like Pavlov's dogs, aren't they? They've been cowed by their treatment by successive governments over the years, that they've lost the ability to question. And I saw that when I went up there in 2014 for the first election as a New Zealand journalist, got accreditation, went to a whole lot of meetings, particularly at the Fiji Elections Office with Mohammed Saneem, and nobody would ask him any questions. And there was a room full of, there'd be 20, 30 journalists in there, and the only person asking him questions was me. And I got taken aside by somebody who said, Cam, you need to dial it back a bit. We don't want these people. We don't want these people. We don't want these people learning to ask questions.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, how is Fiji ever going to become a fully democratic nation if their journalists aren't even trained to hold the powerful to account?
Well, and there's another thing that's also part of this whole small nation thing. The media proprietors in Fiji, who employ these people, of course, want to keep themselves sweet with the government in power. The powers that be, the government of the day, and so there is nothing like the scrutiny that politicians get subjected to routinely in New Zealand and Australia, which is a great shame. But this is where I decided to come in. I mean, nobody pays me. I'm retired, and I sort of do this in my spare time. But of course, I break stories routinely that are not in the Fijian media at all. Yeah, and I mean, this went back to the time of Bainimarama and Kayum, and that nobody was prepared to tell the country that both of them had left for cardiac transplant operations overseas. Yeah, it was just a sort of national secret, and yet that was, I sort of told everybody about that, for instance. And none of this stuff I'm telling you about the Fiji Law Society court challenge to the unlawful appointments of the acting DPP and the judge. The recent direct challenge to the Prime Minister by his own deputy, neither of those stories are in the Fijian media. I mean, it's a culture in which they take the press release, ask a couple of perfunctory questions, and the government controls the narrative, which is a great shame.
Well, the government controlled the narrative quite easily under Bainimarama when they basically took away the advertising from one particular media outlet and gave it all to another one.
Exactly.
And they starved them of revenue and all those things. Now, personally, that's what I'm suggesting that the New Zealand government does with our complicit media that have taken millions of dollars of bribes from the government here, is take away their money and make them play on an even playing field. But I'm not suggesting it should go from one organisation to another, like what happened in Fiji, which was a diabolical scheme that slanted the resources.
Well, this is why I'm so down on these guys, having promised to be different, having promised change, having promised to not be like their predecessors. They're exactly like their predecessors. And on the issue of belonging, of people of ethnicity and different religions belonging, they are much worse than Fiji First. I can't support that under any circumstances, and I don't imagine you doing so either, because as you and I are both part of a minority in Fiji, the white minority, and this fervent ethno-nationalism, indigenous supremacy or whatever, is the antithesis of nation building. You know what I mean?
Well, it's never worked anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world that embarks on ethno-nationalism ends in tears at the least, bloodshed at the worst. And I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that in Fiji. I don't want to see the country of my birth brought to its knees with ethnic violence. I don't want to see that. I want to see Fiji a strong, vibrant democracy that can use its tourism to spread the word around the rest of the Pacific that this is the way you do things. This is the way you conduct yourself.
Well, precisely. You and I have exactly the same agenda in relation to that.
Yeah,
Because one of the worst things, Cam, is that all of this is triggering another exodus from Fiji of the best and brightest. Yeah, the government's suddenly in a panic about the brain drain. Yeah, we know there are skill shortages in Australia and New Zealand that are being filled by people from the region, including Fiji. Yeah, and of course, why wouldn't they come to New Zealand and Australia if the majority population there is saying, we don't want you, you don't belong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the level of vituperation, particularly on social media, is acute. Yeah. I mean, I get called the effing white, C word, without any shame on the part of those people who do that.
No, I know.
In Australia, there's laws against it. I don't know about New Zealand.
Oh, no, you can't do that in New Zealand either. But
no.
What I've found astonishing is that level of animosity that there is. And you're right. I mean, it's not like where we had land confiscations in New Zealand that have led to decades worth of treaty settlements, or the complete ignoring of a group of people who happened to live in Australia for tens of thousands of years before Abel Tasman and James Cook sailed over the horizon and spied a bit of land. Just appalling behaviour that happened in the 1700s, 1800s, early part of the 20th century. Yeah. There's been none of that in Fiji. As you say, 94% of the land is controlled by Itaukai. They've always had control of the land. Control of the land should mean control of the resources.
Well, there is this sort of fortress mentality, and I mean, I can understand it. We saw it in South Africa, didn't we, in the 70s with the Afrikaans? The sort of go to the lager mentality. Defend our culture at all costs, and I think that's a feature of these smaller populations around the world. But you're absolutely right. There are no examples of mono-ethnic nations which have expelled their minorities, and the whole of East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, whatever. There's multiple examples. When you expel, those minorities, particularly if they're educated and particularly if they're business-minded, etc., it degrades your national capability. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
And then when you degrade the national capability and your economy suffers as a result, you end up with and the resulting instability that comes from that. And, of course, having multiple coups or even having the army step in, even if it's to enforce new elections, it drives tourists away. And if you don't have tourists in Fiji, then you're left with being, like you described, a beggar nation, where you're relying on remittances or the work from the United Nations, and that's about it. Because if tourism stops to Fiji, there's a whole lot of people that are reliant on that. Now, what people don't realize is when a coup happens, these sorts of things occur. What happens to the Fijian or the Itaukai Fijians is they go back to the village. The people who suffer are actually the Indian population, because they're the ones who are in these jobs that are reliant on tourism and things like that.
Well, look, can I just make this point? I don't think that even if there is another military intervention in Fiji, as long as it's non-violent, and as long as there is an election date set and a way forward, I don't think it's going to make any difference to the tourist traffic. Can I just say this? Fiji is absolutely booked out for the next couple of years, according to media reports, in the Fijian media. The post-COVID travel boom, which is global, as you know, has resulted in Aussies and Kiwis going to Fiji in record numbers. It's just shy of 1 million a year for the first time, and in fact, global bankers are saying that Fiji has hit peak capacity in relation to the tourism industry, and unless they produce another 5,000 hotels in the next few years, they're going to have to turn people away, and the economic growth that they're expecting to come from the increased number of tourists visiting the country won't be realised, because they just won't have the capacity to deal with that. So and the other thing that I don't need to explain to you is that coups have traditionally happened around Suva, which is on the other side of Viti Levu, and the west of Fiji the western part of Fiji level, which is where the main tourism resorts are, have not really ever been affected by any of the previous coups. So I don't think there's any reason for people to suddenly start saying, "Oh, well, we can't go to Fiji for Christmas, Dad, because there's going to be a coup there."
Well,
That's not the case.
You and I both know that, right? But there are a group of people who won't go, because when you've got a coup, what happens is governments around the world issue do not travel advices. As soon as you get a do not travel advice, you don't have travel insurance and those sorts of things. Now,
well, that's
for me,
true. There is a risk.
For me though, it doesn't do anything, right? Because it's where I was born. I'd go to Fiji anyway, and I know the security situation in a coup means it's a whole lot better. Not that it's particularly bad in any case. I mean, there's parts of Auckland that are far worse than Suva, and even in the worst parts of Suva. And I'm sure there's places in Sydney that you could say you just don't go there.
Well,
but,
yes.
But almost anywhere in Fiji, in Suva, you're happy to go to. It's not a problem.
There has been, though, an increase in crime and a lot of concern of ordinary members of the community about the law and order situation. And part of that is because there's now a huge drug problem in Fiji. Yeah, and it's not just marijuana growing there.
It's methamphetamine.
Methamphetamine trade is huge. And as you know, some of that's been linked to New Zealand. So this is, that's fueling a law and order problem. But my point is that if you have role models in government at the level of the Minister for Education, who almost killed his ex-wife and the Prime Minister's daughter, what sort of message is that sending to the rest of the population about standards?
Well, I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? And when you've got the illegal behaviour, the nepotism, the cronyism going on, it leads to the general impression that things are not all well in Fiji, that there are serious issues, which then leads to speculation that perhaps the military will step in, and that's when people don't want to invest. If you want to build a business in Fiji, you look at all those sort of geopolitical situations, you think, well, is this a place where I want to put $2 million or $5 million or $10 million? Or even more if you're going to build a resort when there's instability. You think,
well, exactly.
Maybe I won't.
And the instability continues. I mean, this is the crazy thing about all of this. All this government has to do is to operate within the parameters of the 2013 Constitution, which they may not have agreed with, but they have actually sworn on the Bible to defend, because it's it's part of the oath of office of every single public official from the president down, including all of the MPs who are now saying the Constitution's rubbish and they don't like it.
And all the soldiers.
Why did you swear on the Bible? And as you know, they're sort of very fundamentalist Christians. Why did you swear on the Bible to uphold a document that you don't believe is valid?
Yeah. That's the thing, isn't it? Because even all the soldiers have sworn to uphold the Constitution.
Yes, so, absolutely.
There will come a point where the RFMF will have to do something. I don't know.
I think we're rapidly approaching that. Yeah. And that's why this clash between the country's lawyers and the judiciary is potentially the watershed moment. Yeah.
Yeah,
because when it gets to that stage, it's not politicians going head to head and the military saying, well, look, you guys have got to work this out. It's the country's lawyers saying the judiciary are actually breaking the supreme law. That's very dangerous.
Well, because you're losing one of those arms of a modern democracy where the judiciary is separated from the politicians, which is separated from the military.
Well, it's my view that the judiciary is no longer independent and takes its instructions from the government of the day, and that is a very serious situation.
Well, as you said, that's a constitutional coup.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm I've got to be careful here. There are very good judges, and I'm not saying the judiciary as a whole is complicit in all of this, but there is one individual, the acting Chief Justice, who is defying the Constitution. He's about to go head-to-head with the Fiji Law Society in relation to all of that. And his conduct since this issue was raised, where the Fiji Law Society said you need to rescind these illegal appointments, has been extraordinary. I mean, last week there was an induction of new lawyers, and in his speech, the acting Chief Justice castigated the president of the Fiji Law Society in public. So they're asking for it.
They are asking for it, but the thing is, Graham, is that every time we see this, I just sit there and die a little bit inside that the country of my birth can't get its act together, and this is not difficult stuff, But this is why we commentate on these things. This is why we write about these things, because we've got a voice, and if nobody in Fiji will use their voice, then we need to.
Well, precisely. And look, the agenda here is the integrity of the institutions of state. If the institution, if people who occupy the principal institutions of state do their jobs and adhere to the rule of law, there is no reason for any of these places to have these difficulties. Yeah, but it's essentially a group of individuals who think that the law doesn't apply to them, that they're above the law, and that they can take it upon themselves to either violate it or change it. And
we know what happens in Fiji if you try and do that.
Well, yes, unfortunately.
And everything that I've seen about the head of the RFMF tells me that this is a guy that has integrity. All his public statements are about adhering to the Constitution. You would be a stupid person to ignore that in Fiji.
Well, the thing is, Raw John Ekoloniwai is a person of immense integrity. Yeah, he's from a chiefly family. He is universally respected, and he is bending over backwards to accommodate this behaviour. That's the problem. Yeah, he's in a very insidious position now, because his officers around him perceive that he has been weak in standing up for this and are pressuring him to intervene. Now, obviously, under those circumstances, if he won't do it,
they will.
The history exactly, and the history of coups in all of these countries is that it's a junior officer who does it. And of course, in 1987, it was Sitiveni Rambuka who carried out the coup in Fiji, while the head of the RFMF, Ratu Epeli Nailatikau, who's just the immediate, one of the recent presidents of the country, was out of the country. And wouldn't this be the irony of ironies, Cam?
Yeah.
If 36 years after he carried out the two coups in Fiji in 1987, Sitiveni Rambuka was removed at gunpoint himself.
Well, I'm sitting here from afar looking at it, and I'm reading what you're writing, and I'm picking up what my friends are saying inside Fiji, and they're all saying the same thing. This feels like we're heading towards an intervention. Let's not use the word coup, but an intervention from the RFMF.
Yeah, I don't like using the coup word, but, a constitutional coup is that it's worked out within the Constitution, but the government falls. A coup is, you'll leave your offices now, or we'll
shoot you.
Force, or no, they never do that.
They never do that. No.
They being prodded by an automatic weapon is usually enough to get you out of your seat.
Well, usually,
even someone like you can.
Usually just a sharp bayonet will do that, but yeah, exactly. But the only time there's been actually shooting is when Spate was involved, and that's why I made the comment about it. I'm not sure he's all there together in his head, because
he was a megalomaniac, and he paid a terrible price, and yet this government wants to free him. This is a guy who was sentenced to death. It was commuted to life imprisonment. When you're sentenced to death, somebody pronounces that you will hang until dead, and that's subsequently commuted. There is no mechanism for you to be released. It's for the term of your natural life, right?
Exactly.
But again, these people think that an absolute convention like that is something that they don't have to take any notice of.
I mean, he was out on an island somewhere, but he's now, residing in Mboro prison.
Yeah, just outside Suva.
Just outside Suva, but it's not a pleasant place as you drive past it. You can see it's not a pleasant place, but it's certainly better than the old Suva prison in Lamy.
Yeah. No, it's not a pleasant place. I mean, I know people who've done time in there, and you're in a small cell with somebody else, and it's a bucket.
Yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
But
not the kind of place you and I would enjoy particularly.
No, we wouldn't. Look, I'm sure we're going to have to talk to you again shortly as things develop. But let's just stay in touch. And
yes, mate.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you today about Fiji and catching up with our joint homeland, really.
Yes.
And
thank you, Cam.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been a real pleasure. Graham has a deep love of the country of his birth, just like me. He's also connected into every aspect of Fijian political life. We used to spend hours over a fair few gins in Suva discussing everything about the country of our birth. It's disappointing to see and hear what is going on up there. But if anybody knows, Graham knows. Don't forget to send comments on Graham's interview to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.